Alright, that's good enough. Howdy, folks. Never too different. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. Tonight we're going to be reading, The Ghost Pirates by William Hope Hodgson. It's a, nautical horror story. We're, as Nightbot says, we won't be responding to chat too much tonight. Because I don't want to just stop reading and, ruin the mood. But, yeah, we're going to be taking it easy tonight and hopefully have a nice, chilling time. And without further ado, I think it's time to jump in. Alright. 1. The figure out of the sea. He began without any circumlocution. I joined the Mort Zestus in Frisco. I heard before I signed on that there was some funny yarns floating around about her. But I was pretty nearly on the beach, and too jolly anxious to get away, to worry about trifles. Besides, by all accounts, she was right enough for us to grub and, as far as grub and treatment went. When I asked fellows to give it a name, they generally could not. All they could tell me was that she was unlucky, and made thundering long passages, and had no more than a fair share of dirty weather. Also, that she had twice had the sticks blown out of her, and her cargo shifted. Besides all these, a heap of other things that might happen to any packet, and would not be comfortable to run into. Still, they were ordinary things, and I was willing enough to risk them to get home. All the same, if I had been given the chance, I should have shipped in some other vessel as a matter of preference. Give me a moment, folks. Let me close the window. Alright. That's better. When I took my bag down, I found that they had signed on the rest of the crowd. You see, the home lot cleared out when they got into Frisco, that is, all except one young fellow, a Cockney who had stuck by the ship in port. He told me afterwards, when I got to know him, that he intended to draw a payday out of her, whether anyone else did or not. The first night I was in her, I found that it was common talk among the other fellows that there was something queer about the ship. They spoke of her as if it were an accepted fact that she was haunted, yet they all treated it as the matter as a joke. All, that is, except the young Cockney, Williams, who instead of laughing at their jests on the subject, seemed to take the whole matter seriously. This made me rather curious. I began to wonder whether there was, after all, some truth underlying the vague stories I had heard. And I took the first opportunity to ask him whether he had any reasons for believing that there was anything in the yarns about the ship. At first I was inclined to be a bit offish, but presently he came around, and told me that he did not know of any particular incident which could be called unusual in the sense in which I meant, yet that at the had so much dirty weather, nothing but that and calms and headwinds. Then other things happened. Sails that he knew, himself, had been properly stowed, were always blowing adrift at night. And then he said a thing that surprised me. "There's too many bloomin' shaders about this air packet. They gets onto your nerves like nothing as ever I seen before in me natural life. He blurted it out all in a heap, and I turned round and looked at him. "Too many shadows," I said. What on earth do you mean? But he refused to explain himself, or tell me anything further. Just shook his head stupidly when I questioned him. He seemed to have taken a sudden, sulky fit. I felt certain that he was acting dense, purposely. I believe the truth of the matter is that he was, in a way, ashamed of having let himself go like he had, in speaking out his thoughts about the shaders. What type of man may think things that type of man may think things at times, but he doesn't often put them into words. Anyhow, I saw it was no use asking any further questions, so I let the matter drop there. Yet, for several days afterwards, I caught myself wondering, at times, what the fellow had meant by shaders. We left Frisco the next day with a fine, fair wind that seemed a bit like putting the stopper on the yarns I had heard about the ship's ill luck. And yet, he hesitated a moment, and then went on again. For the first couple weeks out, nothing unusual happened, and the wind still held fair. I began to feel that I had been rather lucky after all, in the packet into which I had been shunted. Most of the other fellows gave her a good name, and there was a pretty general opinion growing among the crowd that it was all a silly yarn about her being haunted. And then, just when I was settling down to things, something happened that opened my eyes no end. It was in the 8 to 12 watch, and I was sitting on the steps, on the starboard side leading up to the forecastle head. The night was fine, and there was a splendid moon. Away aft I heard the timekeeper strike 4 bells, and the lookout, an old fellow named Jaskett, answered him. As he let go the bell lanyard, he caught sight of me, where I sat quietly smoking. He leaned over the rail and looked down at me. "That you, Jessup?" he asked. "I believe it is," I replied. "We'd have our grandmothers and all the rest of our petticoat relations coming to see if it were always like this," he remarked, reflectively indicating, with a sweep of his pipe in hand, the calmness of the sea and sky. I saw no reason for denying that, and he continued, "If this old packet is haunted, as some on 'em seems to think, well, all as I can say is, let me have the luck to tumble across another of the same sort. Good grub and duff for days, and a decent crowd of 'em aft, and everything comfortable like. So as yer can feel yer knows where yer are. As for a bein' 'aunted, that's all hellish nonsense. I've come across lots of 'em before, as was said to be 'aunted, and so some on 'em was, but 'twasn't with ghostses. One packet I was in, they was that bad yer couldn't sleep a wink in yer watch below, until yer 'ad every stitch out of yer bunk, and 'ad a regular 'unt. Sometimes," at that moment, the relief one of the ordinary seamen, went up the other ladder on the forecastle head, and the old chap turned to ask him why the 'ell he'd not relieved him a bit smarter. The ordinary made some reply, but what it was I did not catch, for, abruptly away aft, my rather sleepy gaze had lighted upon something altogether extraordinary and outrageous. It was nothing less than the form of a man stepping inboard over the starboard rail, a little abaft the main rigging. I stood up and caught at the handrail and started. Behind me, someone spoke. It was the lookout, who had come down off the forecastle head on his way aft to report the name of his relief to the second mate. "What is it, mate?" he asked me, curiously seeing my intent attitude. The thing, whatever it was, had disappeared into the shadows on the lee side of the deck. "Nothing," I replied, shortly, for I was too bewildered then at what my eyes had just shown me to say any more. I wanted to think. The old shellback glanced at me, but only muttered something and went on his way aft. For a minute, perhaps, I stood there, watching, but could see nothing. Then I walked slowly aft as far as the after end of the deck house. From there I could see most of the main decks, but nothing showed except, of course, the moving shadows of the ropes and spars and sails, as they swung to and fro in the moonlight. The old chap who had just come off the lookout had returned forward again, and I was alone on that part of the deck. And then, all at once, I stood peering into the shadows to leeward. I remembered that what Williams had said about there being too many shaders. I had been puzzled to understand his real meaning. Then I had no difficulty now. There were too many shadows. Yet, shadows or no shadows, I realized that for my own peace of mind, I must settle, once and for all, whether the thing I had seemed to see stepping aboard the ocean had been a reality, or simply a phantom, as you might say, of my imagination. My reason said it was nothing more than imagination, a rapid dream. I must have dozed, but something deeper than reason told me that this was not so. I put it to the test and went straight in amongst the shadows. There was nothing. I grew bolder. My common sense told me I must have fancied it all. I walked over to the mainmast and looked behind the pin rail that partly surrounded it, and down into the shadows of the pumps. But here again was nothing. Then I went in under the break of the poop. It was darker there than out on deck. I looked up both sides of the deck and saw they were bare of any such as I had looked for. The assurance was comforting. I glanced at the poop ladders and remembered that nothing could have gone up there without the second mate or the timekeeper seeing it. Then I leant my back up against the bulkhead and thought the whole matter over, rapidly sucking at my pipe and keeping my glance about the deck. I concluded my think and said "no" out loud, and something occurred to me, and I said, "unless," and went over to the starboard bulwarks, and looked over and down into the sea. But there was nothing but sea, and so I turned and made my way forward. My common sense had triumphed, and I was convinced that my imagination had been playing tricks on me. I reached the door on the port side leading into the forecastle, and was about to enter when something made me look behind. As I did so, I had a shaker. Away aft, a dim, shadowy form stood in the wake of a swaying belt of moonlight that swept the deck a bit abaft the main mast. It was the same figure that I had just been attributing to my fancy. I will admit that I felt more than startled. I was quite a bit frightened. I was convinced now that it was no mere imaginary thing. It was a human figure, and yet, with the flicker of the moonlight and the shadows chasing over it, I was unable to say more than that. Then, as I stood there, irresolute and funky, I got the thought that someone was acting the goat, though for what reason or purpose I never stopped to consider. I was glad of any suggestion that my common sense assured me was not impossible, and for the moment I felt quite relieved that the side to the question had not presented itself to me before. I began to pluck up courage. I accused myself of getting fanciful. Otherwise, I should have tumbled to it earlier, and then, funnily enough, in spite of my reasoning, I was still afraid of going aft to discover who that was, standing on the lee side of the main deck. Yet I felt that if I shirked it, I was only fit to be dumped overboard. And so I went, though not with any great speed, as you can imagine. I had gone half the distance, and still the figure remained there, motionless and silent, the moonlight and the shadows playing over it with each roll of the ship. I think I tried to be surprised. If it were one of the fellows playing the fool, he must have heard me coming. And why didn't he scoot while he had the chance? And where could he have hidden himself before? All these things I asked myself, in a rush, with a queer mixture of strides to the port rail, and climbed over it into the sea. I rushed to the side and stared over, but nothing met my gaze except the shadow of the ship sweeping over the moonlit sea. How long only a sort of brain fancy. It seemed, for that little time, deprived, of the power of coherent thought. I seemed for that little time deprived, of the power of coherent thought. I supposed I was dazed, mentally stunned in a way. As I have said, in a minute or so must have, as I said, a minute or so must have gone, while I had been staring into the dark of the water under the ship's side. Then I came suddenly to my ordinary self. The second mate was singing out, "Lee for brace." I went to the braces like a chap in a dream. 2. Give me a second, please. My apologies. What Tammy the Prentice saw. The next morning, in my watch below, I had a look at the places where the strange thing had come aboard and left the ship. But I found nothing unusual, and no clue to help me understand the mystery of the strange man. For several days after that, all went quietly, though I prowled about the decks at night, trying to discover anything fresh that might tend to throw some light on the matter. I was careful to say nothing to anyone about the thing I had seen. In any case, I felt I should only have been laughed at. Several nights passed away in this manner, and I was no nearer to an understanding of the affair. And then, in the middle watch, something happened. It was my wheel. Tammy, one of the first voyage prentices, was keeping time, walking up and down the lee side of the poop. The second mate was forward, leaning over the break of the poop, smoking. The weather still continued fine, and the moon, though declining, was sufficiently powerful to make every detail about the poop stand out distinctly. 3 bells had gone, and I'll admit I was feeling sleepy. Indeed, I believe I must have dozed, for the old packet steered very easily, and there was precious little to do. Ship's head was right on her course, and I felt easier. Then, suddenly, I heard it again. There was no doubt about it this time. I glanced to leeward. There, I saw Tammy reaching over the steering gear. his hand out in the act of trying to touch my arm. I was about to ask him what the devil he wanted, when he held up his finger for silence and pointed forward along the lee side of the poop. In the dim light his face showed palely, and he seemed much agitated. For a few seconds I stared in the direction he indicated, but could see nothing. "What is it?" I asked in an undertone, after a couple of moments further ineffectual peering. "I can't see anything." "Shh!" he muttered, hoarsely, without looking in my direction. Then, all at once, with a quick little gasp, he sprung across the wheelbox and stood beside me, trembling. His gaze appeared to follow the movements of something I could not see. I must say that I was startled. His movement had shown such terror, and the way he stared to leeward made me think he saw something uncanny. "What the deuce is up with you?" I asked, sharply. And then I remembered the second mate. I glanced forward to where he lounged, his back still towards us, and he had not seen Tammy. I turned to the boy. "For goodness sakes, go to the leeward before the second sees you," he said. "If you want to say anything, say it across the wheelbox. You've been dreaming." Even as I spoke, the little beggar caught at my sleeve with one hand, and, pointing across to the log reel with the other, screamed, "He's coming! He's coming!" At this instant, the second mate came running aft, singing out to know what was the matter. Then, suddenly, crouching under the rail, near the log reel, I saw something that looked like a man, but so hazy and unreal that I could scarcely say I saw anything. Yet, like a flash, my thoughts ripped back to the silent figure I had seen in the flicker of the moonlight a week earlier. The second mate reached me, and I pointed dumbly, and yet, as I did so, it was with the knowledge that he would not be able to see what I saw. Queer, wasn't it? And then, almost in a breath, I lost sight of the thing, and became aware that Tammy was hugging my knees. The second continued to stare at the log reel for a brief instant. Then he turned to me with a sneer. "Been asleep, the pair of you, I suppose?" Then, without waiting for my denial, he told Tammy to go to hell out of it and stop his noise, or he'd boot him off the poop. After that, he walked forward to the break of the poop and aft every few minutes, and eyeing me. At times, I thought, with a strange, half-doubtful, half-puzzled look. Later, as soon as I was relieved, I hurried down to the princess's berth. I was anxious to speak to Tammy. There were a dozen questions that worried me, and I was in doubt what I ought to do. I found him crouched on a sea chest, his knees up to his chin, and his gaze fixed on the doorway with a frightened stare. I put my head into the berth, and he gave a gasp. Then he saw who it was, and his face relaxed something of its strained expression. He said, "Come in a low voice, which he tried to steady, and stepped over the washboard and I stepped over the washboard and sat down on a chest facing him. "What was it?" he asked, putting his feet down on the deck and leaning forward. "For God's sake, tell me what it was." His voice had risen, and I put my hand up to warn him. "Shh," I said, "you'll wake the other fellows." He repeated his question, but in a lower tone. I hesitated before answering him. I felt, all at once, that it might be better to deny all knowledge, to say I hadn't seen anything unusual. I thought quickly, and made answer on the turn of the moment. "What was what?" I asked. "That's just the thing I've come to ask you. A pretty pair of fools you made the two of us up on the poop just now with your hysterical tomfoolery." I concluded my remark in a tone of anger. "I didn't," he answered in a passionate whisper. "You know I didn't. You know you saw it yourself. You pointed it out to the second mate. I saw you." The little beggar was nearly crying between fear and vexation at my assumed unbelief. "Rot," I replied. "You know jolly well you were sleeping in your timekeeping. You dreamed something and woke up suddenly. You were off your chump." I was determined to reassure him, if possible. Though goodness, I wanted assurance myself. If he had known of that other thing I had seen down on the main deck, what then? I wasn't asleep, any more than you were," he said bitterly. "And you know it. You're just fooling me. This ship's haunted." "What?" I said sharply. "She's haunted," he said again. "She's haunted." "Who says so?" I inquired in a tone of unbelief. "I do, and you know it." "Everybody knows it, but they don't more than half believe it. I didn't until tonight." "Damn rot," I answered. "That's all blooming old shellsback yarn. She's no more haunted than I am." "It's not damned rot," he replied, totally unconvinced. And it's not old shellsback yarn." "Why won't you say you saw it?" he cried, growing almost tearfully excited, and raising his voice again. I warned him not to wake the other sleepers. "Why won't you say you saw it?" he repeated. I got up from the chest and went towards the door. "You're a young idiot," I said, "and I should advise you not to go gassing about like this round the decks. Take my tip and turn in and get a sleep." You're talking dotty. Tomorrow you'll perhaps feel what an unholy ass you've made of yourself." I stepped over the washboard and left him. I believe he followed me to the door to say something further, but I was halfway forward by then. For the next couple of days I avoided him as much as possible, taking care never to let him catch me alone. I was determined, if possible, to convince him that he had been mistaken in supposing that he had seen anything that night. Yet, after all, it was little enough use, as you will soon see. For, on the night of the second day, there was a further extraordinary development that made denial on my part useless. The man up it. Suddenly, I heard the second mate's voice. "In the main rigging, there! Who's that going aloft?" I sat up on the hatch and listened. There succeeded in an intense silence. Then, the second's voice came again. He was evidently getting wild. "Do you damn well hear me? What the hell are you doing up there? Come down!" I rose to my feet and walked to the windward, for there I could see the break of the poop. The second mate was standing by the starboard ladder. He appeared to be looking up at something that was hidden from me by the topsails. As I stared, he broke out again. "Hell and damnation, you blasted soldier! Come down when I tell you!" He stamped on the poop and repeated his order, savagely, but there was no answer. I started to walk aft. What had happened? Who had gone aloft? Who would be fool enough to go without being told? And then, all at once, a thought came to me. The figure Tammy and I had seen. Had the second man seen something? Someone? Another minute, I was hurrying aft with him to see what was wanted. His voice met us halfway. "Up the main, some of you, smartly now, and find out who That damn fool is up there. See what mischief he's up to." "Aye, aye, sir," several of the men sung out, and a couple jumped into the weather rigging. I joined them, and the rest were proceeding to follow. But the seconds shouted for someone to go up to leeward, in case the fellow tried to get down that side. As I followed the other two aloft, I heard the second mate tell Tammy, whose timekeeping it was, to get down onto the main deck with the other prentice and keep an eye on the fore and aft stays. Said Tammy, and went down to the main deck. The first man to windward had reached the futtock shrouds. His head was above the top, and he was taking a preliminary look before venturing higher. "See anything, Jock?" said Plummer, the man next above me. "Nah," said Jock, tersely, and climbed over the top, and so disappeared from my sight. The fellow ahead of me followed. He reached the futtock rigging and stopped to expectorate. I was close at his heels, and he looked down to me. "What's up, anyway?" he said. "What's he seen? Who are we chasing after?" I said I didn't know, and he swung up to the topmast rigging. I followed on. The chaps on the lee side were about level with us, under the foot of the topsail. I could see Tammy and the other prentice down the main deck, looking upwards. The fellows were a bit excited in a sort of subdued way, though I am inclined to think there was far more curiosity, and perhaps a certain consciousness of the strangeness of it all. I know that, looking to leeward, there was a tendency to keep well together, in which I sympathized. "Must be a bloomin' stowaway," one of the men suggested. I grabbed at the idea instantly, perhaps, and then, in a moment, I dismissed it. I remembered how the first thing had stepped over the rail into the sea. That matter could not be explained in such a manner. With regard to this, I was curious and anxious. I had seen nothing in this time. What could the second mate have seen? I wondered. Were we chasing fancies? Or was there really something real among the shadows above us? My thoughts returned to that thing Tammy and I had seen near the log reel. I remembered how incapable the second mate had been of seeing anything then. I remembered how natural it had seemed that he should not be able to see. I caught the word "stowaway" again. After all, that might explain away this affair. It would. My train of thought was broken suddenly. One of the men was shouting and gesticulating. "I seize him! I seize him!" He was pointing upwards over our heads. "Where?" said the man above me. "Where?" I was looking up for all that I was worth. I was conscious of a certain sense of relief. It is real, then, I said to myself. I screwed my head round and looked along the yards above us. Yet still I could see nothing except shadows and patches of light. Down on the deck, I caught the second mate's voice. "Have you got him?" he was shouting. "Not yet, sir," sung out the lowest man on the lee side. "We seize him, sir," said Cuon. I don't, I said. "There he is again," he said. We had reached the taglant rigging, and he was pointing up to the royal yard. "You're a fool, Cuon. That's what you are." The voice came from above. It was Jock's, and there was a burst of laughter at Cuon's expense. I could see Jock now. He was standing in the rig. Thinking the second is "Just a shaft." He began to descend. "Then there's no one?" I asked. "Nah," he said briefly. As we reached the deck, the second mate ran down off the poop. He came towards us with an expectant air. "You've got him?" he asked confidently. "There wasn't anyone," I said. "What?" he nearly shouted. "You're hiding something," he continued angrily, glancing from one to another. "Out with it! Who was it?" "We're hiding nothing," I replied, speaking for the lot. "There's no one up there." The second looked round upon us. "Am I a fool?" he asked contemptuously. There was an assenting silence. "I saw him myself," he continued. "Tammy here saw him. He wasn't over the top when I first spotted him. There was no mistake about it. It's all damned rot saying he's not there." "Well, he's not, sir," I answered. "Jock went right up to the royal yard." The second mate said nothing in immediate reply, but went aft a few steps and looked up the main. Then he saw the two apprentices. "Sure you boys didn't see anyone coming down from the main?" he inquired suspiciously. "Yes, sir," they answered together. "Anyway," I heard him mutter to himself, "I'd have spotted him myself if he had." "Have you any idea, sir, who it was you saw?" I asked at this juncture. He looked at me keenly. "No," he said. He thought for a few moments while we all stood about in silence, waiting for him to let us go. "By the holy poker!" he exclaimed. "But I ought to have thought of that before." He turned and eyed us individually. "You're all here?" he asked. "Yes, sir," we said in chorus. I could see that he was counting us. Then he spoke again. "All of you men stay here where you are. Tammy, you go into your place and see if the other fellows are in their bunks. Then come and tell me, smartly now." The boy went, and he turned to the other apprentice. You get along forward to the forecastle," he said. "Count the other watch, and then come aft and report to me." The youngster disappeared along the deck to the forecastle. Tammy returned from his visit to the glory hole to tell the second mate that the other two prentices were sound asleep in their bunks, whereupon the second bundled him off to the carpenter's and sailmaker's berth, to see whether they were turned in. While he was gone, the other boy came aft and reported that all men were in their bunks and asleep. "Sure?" the second asked him. "Quite, sir," he answered. The second mate made a quick gesture. "Go and see if the steward is in his berth," he said abruptly. It was plain to me that he was tremendously puzzled. "You've something yet to learn, Mr. Second Mate? You've something yet to learn yet, Mr. Second Mate," I thought to myself. Then I fell to wondering to what conclusions he would come. A few seconds later, Tammy returned to say that the carpenter, sailmaker, and doctor were all turned in. The second mate muttered something and told him to go down into the saloon to see whether the first and third mates, by any chance, were not in their berths. Tammy started off, then halted. "Shall I have a look into the old man's place, sir, while I'm down there?" he inquired. "No," said the second mate. "Do what I told you, then come and tell me. If anyone's to go into the captain's cabin, it's got to be me." Tammy said, "Aye, aye, sir," and skipped away up onto the poop. While he was gone, the other apprentice came up to say that the steward was in his berth, and that he wanted to know what the hell he was fooling around his part of the ship for. The second mate said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he turned to us and told us we might go forward. As we moved off in a body and talking in undertones, Tammy came down from the poop and went up to the second mate. I heard him say that the two mates were in their berths asleep. Then he added, as if it were an afterthought, "So's the old man." "I thought I told you," said the second mate. "I didn't, sir," Tammy said. "His cabin door was open." The second mate started to go aft. I caught a fragment of a remark he was making to Tammy. "Accounted for the whole crew, He went up onto the poop. I did not catch the rest. Howdy, Froggy. I'm reading, so I'm not gonna be responding to chat too much, but thanks for coming. Hope you enjoy. I had loitered a moment. Now, however, I hurried after the others. As we neared the forecastle, one bell went, and we roused out to the other watch, and told them what jinx we had been up to. "I reckon he must be Rocky," one of the men remarked. "Not him," said another. "He's been having 40 winks on the break, and dreamed his mother-in-law had come on her visit, friendly like." There was some laughter at this suggestion, and I caught myself smiling along with the rest, though I had no reason for sharing their belief that there was nothing in it at all. "I might have been a stowaway, said Huon, the one who had suggested it before. Remarked to one of the ABs named Stubbins, a short, rather surly-looking chap. "Might have been hell," returned Stubbins. "Stowaways ain't such fools as all that." "I don't know," said the first. I wish I had asked the second what he thought about it." "Have yer seen?" He hesitated and looked at me, struggling inward to express himself. "Well?" I prompted. For perhaps a minute he tried to say something. Then his expression altered suddenly from doubt and something else more indefinite to a pretty grim look of determination. He spoke. "I'm blind," he said. "If I don't take her payday out of her shaders or no shaders." I looked at him with astonishment. Hold on. "I'm blind," he said. "If I don't take her payday out of her shaders or no shaders." I looked at him with astonishment. "What's it got to do with you getting your payday out of her?" I asked. He nodded his head with a sort of solid resolution. "Look here," he said. I waited. Their crowd cleared," he indicated with his hand and pipe towards the stern. "You mean in Frisco?" I said. "Yas," he replied. "And with her scent of her pay, I stayed. I comprehended him suddenly. "You think they saw?" I hesitated. Then I said, "Shadows?" He nodded, but said nothing. And so they all bunked? He nodded again and began tapping out his pipe on the edge of his bunk board. "And the officers and the skipper?" I asked. "Fresh 'uns," he said, and got out of his bunk, for 8 bells was striking. I apologize for stumbling over that so hard. A large portion of the dialogue in this is written phonetically, with pretty funky accents, so it's kind of, sometimes it's hard to know what is trying to be said. 4. The fooling with the sail. It was on the Friday night that the second mate had the watch aloft looking for the man up the main, and for the next 5 days little else was talked about, though with the exception of Williams, Tammy, and myself, no one seemed to think of treating the matter seriously. Perhaps I should not exclude Huon, who still persisted on every occasion that there was a stowaway on board. As for the second mate, I have very little doubt now, but that he was beginning to realize there was something deeper and less understandable than he had at first dreamed of. Yet, all the same, I know he had to keep his guesses and half-formed opinions pretty well to himself, for the old man and the first mate chaffed him unmercifully about his bogey. This I got from Tammy, who had heard them both ragging him during the second dog watch the following day. There was another thing Tammy told me that showed how the second mate bothered about his inability to understand the mysterious appearance and disappearance of the man he had seen go aloft. He had made Tammy give him every detail he could remember about the figure we had seen by the log reel. What is more, the second had not even affected to treat the matter lightly, nor as a thing to be sneered at, but had listened seriously and asked a great many questions. It is very evident to me that he was reaching out towards the only possible conclusion, though, goodness knows, it was one that was impossible and improbable enough. It was on the Wednesday night after the 5 days of talk I have mentioned that there came to me and those who knew another element of fear. And yet, I can quite understand that at that time, those who had seen nothing would find little to be afraid of in all that I am going to tell you. Still, even they were much puzzled and astonished, perhaps, after all, a little awed. There was so much in the affair that was inexplicable, and yet again, such a lot that was unnatural and commonplace. For when all is said and done, it was nothing more than the blowing adrift of one of the sails, yet accompanied by what were really significant details, significant, that is, in the light of that which Tammy and I and the second mate knew. 7 bells, and then 1, had gone in the first watch, and our side was being roused out to relieve the mates. Most of the men were already out of their bunks and sitting about on their sea chests, getting into their togs. Suddenly, one of the prentices in the other watch put his head in through the doorway on the port side. The mate wants to know," he said, "which of you chaps made fast the Fore Royal last watch?" "What's he want to know that for?" inquired one of the men. "The lee side's blowing adrift," said the prentice, "and he says the chap who made it fast is to go up and see to it as soon as the watch is relieved."
"Oh, does he? Well, 'twasn't me, anyhow," replied the man. You'd better ask him you'd better ask some of the others."
Ask what?" inquired Plummer, getting out of his bunk sleepily. The prentice repeated his message. The man yawned and stretched himself. Let me see, he muttered, and scratched his head with one hand while he fumbled for his trousers with the other.
"Who made their Fore Royal fast?"
He got into his trousers and stood up.
Why, they're ordinary, of course. Who else do you suppose?"
"That's all I wanted to know," said the prentice, and went away.
Hi, Tom, Stubbins sung out to the ordinary. "Wake up, you lazy young devil. Their mate's just sent to inquire who it was made the Fore Royal fast. It was all blowing adrift, and he says you're to get along as soon as 8 bells goes and make it fast again." Tom jumped out of his bunk and began to dress quickly. "Blown adrift," he said. "There ain't all that much wind, and I tucked the ends of the gaskets well underneath the other turns." "Perhaps one of their gaskets is rotten and given away," suggested Stubbins.
"Anyway,
you'd better hurry up. It's just on 8 bells.
A minute later, 8 bells went, and we trooped away aft for roll call. As soon as the names were called, I saw the mate lean towards the second and say something. Then the second mate sung out,
"Tom!"
"Sir," answered Tom.
"Was it you made fast the Fore Royal last watch?"
"Yes, sir."
"How's that it's broken adrift?"
"Can't say, sir."
"Well, it has, and you'd better jump aloft and shove the gasket round it again. And mind you, make a better job of it this time."
"Aye, aye, sir," said Tom, and followed the rest of us forward. Reaching the fore rigging, he climbed into it and began to make his way leisurely aloft.
I could see him with a fair amount of distinctness, as the moon was very clear and bright, though getting old. I went over to the weather pin rail and leaned up against it, watching him while I filled my pipe. The other men, both the watch on the deck and the watch below, had gone into the forecastle, so that I imagined I was the only one about the main deck. Yet, a minute later, I discovered that I was mistaken, for as I proceeded to light up, I saw Williams, the young Cockney, come out from under the lee of the house, and turn and look up at the ordinary as he went steadily upwards. I was a little surprised, as I knew he and the 3 of the others had a poker fight on, and he'd won over 60 pounds of tobacco. I believe I opened my mouth to sing out to him to know why he wasn't playing, and then, all at once, there came into my mind the memory of my first conversation with him. I remembered that he had said sails were being blown adrift at night. I remembered the, then, unaccountable emphasis he had laid on those 2 words, and remembering that, I felt suddenly afraid. For, all at once, the absurdity had struck me of a sail, even a badly stowed one, blowing adrift in such a fine and calm weather as we were having. I wondered I had not seen before that there was something queer and unlikely about the affair. Sails don't blow adrift in fine weather, with the sea calm and the ship as steady as a rock. I moved away from the rail and went towards Williams. He knew something, or at least, he guessed at something that was very much a blankness to me at the time. Up above, the boy was climbing up. To what? That was the thing that made me feel so frightened. Ought I to tell all I knew and guessed? And then, who should I tell? I should only be laughed at. Williams turned towards me and spoke. "God," he said, "it's started again!" What, I said, though I knew what he meant. "Them sails," he said, and made a gesture towards the fore-royal. I glanced up briefly. All the lee side of the sail was adrift, from a bunt gasket outwards. Lower, I saw Tom. He was hoisting himself into the topgallant rigging. Williams spoke again. "We lost two on 'em. We lost 2 on 'em just sim way comin' art." "2 of the men!" I exclaimed. "Yus," he said tersely. "I can't understand," I went on. "I never heard anything about it." Who'd yer got to tell yer about it?" he said. I made no reply to his question. Indeed, I had scarcely comprehended it, for the problem of what I ought to do in the matter had risen again in my mind. "I've a good mind to go aft and tell his second mate all I know," I said. "He's seen something himself that he can't explain away, and anyway, I can't stand the state of things. If the second mate knew all—" "Garn," he cut in, interrupting me. "And be told you're a blasted idiot? Not you're stay where you are." I stood irresolute. What he had said was perfectly correct, and I was positively stumped what to do for the best. That there was a danger aloft, I was convinced, though if I had been asked my reasons for supposing this, they would have been hard to find. Yet of its existence, where was I? I was certain, as though my eyes already saw it. I wondered whether, being so ignorant of the form it would assume, I could stop it by joining Tom on the yard. This thought came as I stared up at the royal. Tom had reached the sail and was standing on the foot rope, close to the bunt. He was bending over the yard and reaching down for the slack of the sail. And then, as I looked, I saw the belly of the royal tossed up and down abruptly, as though a sudden heavy gust of wind had caught it. I'm blind! Williams began with a sort of excited expectation, and then he stopped as abruptly as he began. For in a moment, the sail had thrashed right over the after side of the yard, apparently knocking Tom clean off the foot rope. "My God!" I shouted out loud. "He's gone!" For an instant, there was a blur over my eyes, and Williams was singing out something that I could not catch. Then, just as quickly, it went and I could see him again clearly. Williams was pointing, and I saw something black swinging below the yard. Williams called out something fresh and made a run for the fore rigging. I caught the last part. "There, Garsket!" Straight away I knew that Tom had managed to grab the gasket as he fell, and I bolted after Williams to give him a hand in getting the youngster to safety. Down on the deck, I caught the sound of running feet, and then the second mate's voice. He was asking what the devil was up, but I did not trouble to answer him then. I wanted all my breath to help me aloft. I knew very well that some of the gaskets were little better than old shackens, and unless Tom got a hold of something on the topgallant yard below him, he might come down with a run any moment. I reached the top and lifted myself over it in quick time. Williams was some distance above me. In less than half a minute, I reached the topgallant yard. Williams had gone up onto the royal. I slid out onto the topgallant foot rope until I was just below Tom. Then I sung out to him to let himself down to me, and I would catch him. He made no answer, and I saw that he was hanging in a curiously limp fashion, and by one hand. William's voice came down to me from the royal yard. He was singing out to me to go up and give him a hand to pull Tom up onto the yard. When I reached him, he told me that the gasket had hitched itself around the young lad's wrist. I bent beside the yard and peered down. It was as Williams had said, and I realized now, nearing a thing it had been, realized how near a thing it had been. Strangely enough, even at that moment, the thought came to me how little wind there was. I remembered the wild way in which the sail had lashed at the boy. All this time I was busily working, unreeving the port buntline. I took the end and made a running bowline with it round the gasket, and let the loop slide down over the boy's head and shoulders. Then I took a strain on it and tightened it under his arms. A minute later we had him safely on the yard between us. In the uncertain moonlight, I could just make out the mark of a great lump on his forehead, where the foot of the sail must have caught him when it knocked him over. As we stood there a moment, taking our breath, I caught the sound of the second mate's voice close beneath us. Williams glanced down, then looked up at me and gave a short, grunting laugh. "Crikey," he said. "What's up?" I asked quickly. He jerked his head backwards and down. I screwed round a bit, holding the jackstay with one hand and steadying the insensible ordinary with the other. In this way I could look below at first. At first I could see nothing. Then the second mate's voice came up to me again. "Who the hell are you? What are you doing?" I saw him now. He was standing at the foot of the weather topgallant rigging. His face was turned upwards, peering round at the after side of the mast. It showed to me only as a blurred, pale-colored oval in the moonlight. He repeated his question. "It's Williams and I, sir," I said. "Tom here has had an accident." Yes. I stopped. He began to come up higher towards us. From the rigging to leeward there came suddenly a buzz of men talking. The second mate reached us. "Well, what's up, anyway?" he inquired suspiciously. "What's happened?" He had bent forward and was peering at Tom. I started to explain, but he cut me short with, "Is he dead?" "No, sir," I said. "I don't think so. But the poor beggars had a bad fall." He He was hanging by the gasket when we got to him. The sail knocked him off the yard." "What?" he said sharply. "The wind caught the sail and it lashed back over the yard." "What wind?" he interrupted. "There's no wind, scarcely." He shifted his weight onto the other foot. "What do you mean?" "I mean what I say, sir. The wind brought the foot of the sail over the top of the yard and knocked Tom clean off the foot rope. Williams and I both saw it happen." "But there's no wind to do such a thing. You're talking nonsense." It seemed to me that there was as much of a bewilderment as anything in his voice. Yet I could tell that he was suspicious, though of what I doubted whether he himself could have told. He glanced at Williams and seemed to be about to say something. Then, seeming to change his mind, he turned and sung out to one of the men who had followed him aloft to go down and pass out a coil of new 3-inch manila and a rail block. And a tail block. "Smartly now," he concluded. "Aye, aye, sir," said the man, and went down swiftly. The second mate turned to me. "When you've got Tom below, I shall want a better explanation of all this than the one you've given me. It won't wash." "Very well, sir," I answered, "but you won't get any other." "What do you mean?" he shouted at me. I'll let you know I'll have no impertinence from you or anyone else." "I don't mean any impertinence, sir. I mean that's the only explanation there is to give." "I tell you it won't wash," he repeated. "There's something too damn funny about it all. I shall have to report the matter to the captain. I can't tell him that yarn," he broke off abruptly. "It's not the only damned funny thing that's happened aboard this old hooker," I answered. "You ought to know that, sir." "What do you mean?" he asked quickly. "Well, sir, I said, to be straight, what about the chap you sent us hunting after up on the Main the other night? That was a funny enough affair, wasn't it? This one isn't half so funny." "That will do, Jessup," he said angrily. "I won't have any back talk." Yet there was something about his tone that told me I had gotten one in on my own. He seemed all at once less able to appear confident that I was telling him a fairy tale. After that, for perhaps a minute, he said nothing. I guessed he was doing some hard thinking. When he spoke again, it was on the matter of getting the ordinary down on the deck. "One of you'll have to go down the lee side and steady him down," he concluded. He turned and looked downwards. "Are you bringing the gantline?" he sang out. "Yes, sir," I heard one of the men answer. A moment later, I saw the man's head appear over the top. He had the tail block slung around his neck and the end of the gantline over his shoulder. Very soon we had the gantline rigged and Tom back down on deck. Then we took him onto the forecastle and put him in his bunk. The second mate had sent for some brandy, and now he started to dose him well with it. At the time, a couple of men chafed his hands and feet. In a little, he began to show signs of coming round. Presently, after a sudden fit of coughing, he opened his eyes. With a surprised, bewildered stare, then he caught the edge of his bunk board and sat up, giddily. One of the men steadied him, while a second mate stood back and eyed him critically. The boy rocked as he sat, and put up his hands to his head. "Here," said the second mate, "take another drink." Tom caught his breath and choked a little. Then he spoke. "By gum," he said, "my head does ache." He put up his hand again and felt the lump on his forehead. Then he bent forward and stared round at the men grouped about his bunk. "What's up?" he inquired in a confused sort of way, and seeming as if he could not see us clearly. "What's up?" he asked again. "That's just what I want to know," said the second mate, speaking for the first time with some sternness. "I ain't been snoozing while there's been a job on," Tom inquired anxiously. He looked round at the men appealingly. "It's knocked him dotty, strikes me," said one of the men audibly. "No," I said, answering Tom's question. You've had "Shut that, Jessup," said the second mate, quickly interrupting me. "I want to hear what the boy's got to say for himself." He turned again to Tom. "You were up at the Four Royal," he prompted. Can't say I was, sir," said Tom doubtfully. I could see that he had not gripped the second mate's meaning. "But you were," said the second with some impatience. It was blowing adrift, and I sent you up to shove a gasket round it." "Blown adrift, sir?" said Tom dully. "Yes, blowing adrift. Don't I speak plainly?" The dullness went from Tom's face suddenly. "So it was, sir," he said, his memory returning. "The bloomin' sail got chock full of wind. It caught me bang in the face." He paused a moment. "I believe," he began, and then stopped once more. "Go on," said the second mate. "Spit it out." I don't know, sir," said Tom. "I don't understand." He hesitated again. "That's all I can remember," he muttered, and put his hand up to the bruise on his forehead, as though trying to remember something. In the momentary silence that succeeded, I caught the voice of Stubbins. "There hain't hardly no wind," he said, saying in a puzzled tone. There was a low murmur of assent from the surrounding men. The second mate said nothing, and I glanced at him curiously. Was he beginning to see, I wondered, how useless it was to try to find any sensible explanation of the affair? I had begun at last to couple it with the peculiar business of the Had he begun at last to couple it with the peculiar business of the man up the main? I am inclined now to think that this was so, for after staring after a few minutes at Tom in a doubtful sort of way, he went out of the forecastle, saying that he would inquire further into the matter in the morning. Yet, when the morning came, he did no such thing. As for reporting the affair to the skipper, I much doubt it. Even did he, it must have been in a very casual way, for we heard nothing more about it, though, of course, we talked it over pretty thoroughly amongst ourselves. With regard to the second mate, even now I am rather puzzled by his attitude to us aloft. Sometimes I have thought he must have suspected us of trying to play off some trick on him. Perhaps, at the time, he still half suspected one of us being in some way connected to the other business. Or again, he may have been trying to fight against the conviction that was being forced upon him, that there was really something impossible and beastly about the old packet. Of course, these are only suspicions, and then, close upon this, there were further developments. 5. The End of Williams. As I have said, there was a lot of talk among the crowd first forward about Tom's strange accident. None of the men knew what Williams and I had seen. Williams and I had seen it happen. Stubbins gave it as his opinion that Tom had been sleepy and missed the foot rope. Tom, of course, would not have this by any means. Yet he had no one to appeal to, for at the time he was just as ignorant as the rest that we had seen the sail flap up over the yard. Stubbins insisted that it stood to reason it couldn't be the wind. There wasn't any, he said, and the rest of the men agreed with him. Well, I said, I don't know about all that. I'm a bit inclined to think Tom's yarn is the truth. How do you make that out? Stubbins asked unbelievingly. There hain't nothing like enough wind. What about the place on his forehead? I inquired in turn. How are you going to explain that? I expect he knocked himself there when he slipped, he answered. Likely nuffly, agreed old Jasket, who was sitting smoking on a chest nearby. Well, you're both a damn long way off out of it, Tom chipped in, pretty warm. I wasn't asleep, and the sail did bloomin' well hit me. Don't you be impertinent, young feller, said Jasket. I joined in again. There's another thing, Stubbins, I said. The gasket Tom was hanging by was on the after side of the yard. That looks as if the sail might have flapped over it. If there were enough wind to do the one, it seems to me that it might have done the other. Do you mean that it was hunder over the yard, over their top? He asked. Over the top, of course. What's more, the foot of the sail was hanging over the after part of the yard, in a bight. Stubbins was plainly surprised at that, and before he was ready with his next objection, Plummer spoke. "Who saw it?" he asked. "I saw it," I said, a bit sharply. "So did Williams. So, for that matter, did the second mate." Plummer relapsed into silence and smoked, and Stubbins broke out afresh. "I reckon Tom must have had a hold of the foot and the gasket, and pulled him over the yard when he stumbled." "No," interrupted Tom. "The gasket was under the sail. I couldn't even see it. And I hadn't time to get a hold of the foot of the sail before it up and caught me smack in the face." How did you get hold the gasket when you fell, then?" asked Plummer. "He didn't get a hold of it," I answered for Tom. "It had taken a turn around his wrist, and that's how we found him hanging." "Do you mean to say he hadn't got a hold of their gasket?" Quan inquired, pausing in the lighting of his pipe. "Of course I do," I said. "A chap doesn't go hanging onto a rope when he's jolly well been knocked senseless." "You're richt," assented Jock. "You're quite right there, Jessup." Quan concluded the lighting of his pipe. "I don't know," he said. I went on without noticing him. "Anyway, when Williams and I found him, he was hanging by the gasket, and it had a couple of turns around his wrist. And besides that, I had said before, the foot of the sail was hanging over the after side of the yard, and Tom's weight on the gasket was holding it there." "It's damned queer," said Stubbins in a puzzled voice. "There don't seem to be no way of getting a proper explanation to it." I glanced at Williams to suggest that I should tell him what we had seen, but he shook his head, and after a moment's thought, it seemed to me that there was nothing to be gained by doing so. We had no very clear idea of the thing that had happened, and our half-facts and guesses would have only tended to make the matter appear more grotesque and unlikely. The only thing to be done was to wait and watch. If we could only get a hold of something tangible, then we might hope to tell all that we knew without being made into laughingstocks. I came out of my think abruptly. Stubbins was speaking again. He was arguing the matter with one of the other men. "You see, with there being no wind, scarcely their thing's impossible, and yet—" The other man interrupted with some remark I did not catch. "No," I heard Stubbins say. "I'm out of my reckoning. I don't savvy it one bit. It's too much like a damned fairy tale." "Look at his wrist," I said. Tom held out his right hand and arm for inspection. It was considerably swollen where the rope had been round it. "Yes," admitted Stubbins, "that's right enough, but it don't tell you nothing." I made no reply. As Stubbins said, it told you nothing. And there I let it drop. Yet, I have told you this, as showing how the matter was regarded in the forecastle. Still, it did not occupy our minds very long, for, as I have said, there were further developments. 3 following nights passed quietly, and then, on the 4th, all those curious signs and hints culminated suddenly in something extraordinarily grim. Yet, everything had been so subtle and intangible, and indeed so was the affair itself, that only one who had actually come in touch with the invading fear seemed really capable of comprehending the terror of the thing.
The men, for the most part, began to say the ship was unlucky, and of course, as usual, there was some talk of there being a Jonah in the ship. Still, I cannot say that none of the men realized there was anything horrible and frightening in it at all, for I am sure that some did, a little, and I think Stubbins was certainly one of them, though I feel certain that he did not, at that time, grasp a quarter of the real significance that underlay the several queer matters that had disturbed our nights. He seemed to fail, somehow, to grasp the element of personal danger that, to me, was already plain. He lacked sufficient imagination, I suppose, to piece the things together, to trace the natural sequence of the events and their development. Yet I must not forget, of course, that he had no knowledge of those two first incidents. If he had, perhaps, he might have stood where I did. As it was, he had not seemed to reach out at all, not even in the matter of Tom and the Four Royal. Now, however, after the thing I'm about to tell you, he seemed to see a little way into the darkness, and realize the possibilities. I remember the fourth night well. It was clear, starlit, moonless sort of night. At least, I think there was no moon, or at any rate the moon could not have been more than a little thin crescent, for it was near the dark time. The wind had breezed up a bit, but still remained steady. We were slipping along at about 6 or 7 knots an hour. It was our middle watch on deck, and the ship was full of the blow and hum of the wind aloft. Williams and I were the only ones about the main deck. He was leaning over the weather-pin rail, smoking, while I was pacing up and down between him and the forehatch. Stubbins was on lookout. 2 bells had gone some minutes. I was wishing to goodness that it was 8, and time to turn in. Suddenly, overhead, there was There sounded a sharp crack, like the report of a rifle shot. It was followed instantly by the rattle and crash of a sailcloth thrashing in the wind. Williams jumped away from the rail and ran aft a few steps. I followed him, and together we stared upwards to see what had gone. Indistinctly I made out that the weather sheet of the fore-t'gallant had carried away, and the clew of the sail was whirling and banging about in the air, and every few moments hitting the steel yard a blow like the thump of a great sledgehammer. "It's the shackle, or one of the links that's gone, I think," shouted Williams, above the noise of the sail. "That's the spectacle that's hitting the yard." "Yes," he shouted. "That's the spectacle that's hitting the yard." "Yes," he shouted back, and went to get hold of the clew line. I ran to give him a hand. At the same moment, I caught the second mate's voice away aft, shouting. Then came the noise of running feet, and the rest of the watch, and the second mate, were with us almost at the same moment. In a few minutes we had the yard lowered and the sails clewed up. Then Williams and I went aloft to see where the sheet had gone. It was much as I had supposed. The spectacle was all right, but the pin had gone out of the shackle, and the shackle itself was jammed into the sheave hole in the yard arm. Williams sent me down for another pin while he unbent the clew line, and overhauled it down to the sheet. When I returned with the fresh pin, I screwed it into the shackle, clipped it on the clew line, and swung it out to the men to take a pull on the rope. This they did, and at the second heave the shackle came away. When it was high enough, I went up onto the t'gallant yard and held the chain, while Williams shackled it. "Right-ho, Williams," I said, getting into the rigging. "Don't let the ship's bogey run away with you."
This remark I made in a moment of light-heartedness, such as will come to anyone aloft at times. I was exhilarated for the time being, and quite free from the sense of fear that had been with me. All the reality of all the impossible details of the past weeks came back to me, vivid and beastly. "What do you mean, Williams?" I asked him. But he had shut up and would say nothing. "What do you know? How much do you know?" I went on quickly. "Why did you never tell me that you—" The second mate's voice interrupted me abruptly. "Now then, up there, are you going to keep us waiting all night? One of you come down and give us a pull with the halyards. The other stay up and light up the gear." "Aye, aye, sir," I shouted back. Then I turned to Williams hurriedly. "Look here, Williams," I said. "If you think there is really a danger in your being alone up here—" I hesitated for the words to express what I meant. Then I went on. "Shall I stay?" I asked definitely. "Garn," he said. "Don't yer fret yourself. I'll take her bloomin' payday out of her. Blast 'em, I ain't funking of 'em." I went. That was the last words Williams spoke to anyone living. I reached the decks and tailed onto the halyards. We had nearly mastheaded the yard, and the second mate was looking up at the dark outline of the sail, ready to sing out, "Belay!" when all at once there came a queer, queer sort of muffled shout from Williams. Vast hauling, you men!" shouted the second mate. We stood silent and listened. "What's that, Williams?" he sung out. "Are you clear?" For nearly half a minute we stood, listening, but there came no reply. Some of the men said afterwards that they had noticed a curious rattling and vibrating noise aloft that sounded faintly above the hum and swirl of the wind, like the sound of loose ropes being shaken and slided together, you know. Whether this noise was really heard, or whether it was something that had no existence outside of their imaginations, I cannot say. I heard nothing of it, but then I was at the tail end of the rope, and furthest from the fore rigging, while those who heard it were on the fore part of the halyards, and close up to the shrouds. The second mate put his hands to his mouth. "Are you all clear there?" he shouted again. The answer came, unintelligible and unexpected. It ran like this. "Blast yer! I stayed! Did yer think? Drive! Payday!" And then there was a sudden silence. I stared up at the dim sail, astonished. "He's dotty," said Stubbins, who had been told to come off the lookout and give us a pull. "He's as mad as a bloomin' adder," said Q1, who was standing foreside of me. "He's been queer all along." "Silence there!" shouted the second mate. Then, "Williams!" No answer. "Williams!" more loudly. Still no answer. Then, "Damn you, you jumped up cockney crocodile! Can't you hear? Are you blooming well deaf?" There was no answer, and the second mate turned to me. "Jump aloft smartly now, Jessup, and see what's wrong." "Aye, aye, sir," I said, and made a run for the rigging. I felt a bit queer. Had Williams gone mad? He had certainly always been a bit funny. Or, and the thought came with a jump, had he seen— I did not finish. Suddenly, up aloft there sounded a frightful scream. I stopped with my hand on the sheer pole. The next instant, something fell out of the darkness. A heavy body. That struck the deck near the waiting men, with a tremendous crash and a loud,
ringing, wheezy sound that sickened me. Several of the men shouted out in their fright and let go of the halyards, but luckily the stopper held it, and the yard did not come down. Then, for the space of several seconds, there was a dead silence among the crowd, and it seemed to me that the wind had it in a strange moaning note. The second mate was the first to speak. His voice came so abruptly that it startled me. "Got a light, one of you, quick, now!" There was a moment's hesitation. "Fetch one of the binnacle lamps, you Tammy." "Aye, aye, sir." "Aye, aye, sir," the youngster said in a quavering voice, and ran aft. In less than a minute, I saw the light coming towards us along the deck. The boy was running. He reached us and handed the lamp to the second mate, who took it and went towards the dark, huddled heap on the deck. He held the light out before him and peered out at the thing. "My God!" he said. "It's Williams!" He stooped lower with the light, and I saw details. It was Williams right enough. The second mate had told a couple of men to lift him and straighten him out on the hatch. Then he went aft to call the skipper. He returned in a couple of minutes with an old ensign, which he spread over the poor beggar. Almost directly, the captain came hurrying forward along the decks. He pulled back one end of the ensign and looked. Then he put it back quietly, and the second mate explained all that what we knew in a few words. "Would you leave him where he is, sir?" he asked. "Would you leave him where he is, sir?" he asked, after he had been told everything. "The night's fine," said the captain. "You may as well leave the poor devil there." He turned and went aft, slowly. The man who was holding the light swept it around so that it showed the place where Williams had struck the deck. The second mate spoke abruptly. "Get a broom and a couple of buckets, you!" and turned sharply and ordered Tammy onto the poop. As soon as he had seen the yard mast headed and the ropes cleared up, he followed Tammy. He knew well enough that it would not do for the youngster to let his mind dwell too much on the poor chap on the hatch. And I found out, a little later, that he gave the boy something to occupy his thoughts. After they had gone aft, we went to the forecastle. Everyone was moody and frightened. For a little while, we sat about in our bunks and on our chests, and no one said a word. The watch below were all asleep, and not one of them knew what had happened. All at once, Plumbers, whose wheel it was, stepped over the starboard washboard into the forecastle. "What's up, anyway?" he asked. "Is Williams much hurt?" "Shh," I said. "You'll wake the others. Who's taking your wheel?" "Tammy. Their second mate sent him. He said I could go forward and have her smoke. He said Williams had her fall." He broke off and looked across the forecastle. "Where is he?" inquired in a puzzled tone. I glanced at the others, but no one seemed inclined to start yarning about it. "He fell from the topgallant rigging," I said. "Where is he?" he repeated. "Smashed up," I said. "He's lying on the hatch." "Dead?" he asked. I nodded. I guess 'twere something pretty happen." He looked round at the lot of us sitting there, silent and smoking. "No one knows," I said, and glanced at Stubbins. I caught him eyeing me, doubtfully. After a moment's silence, Plummer spoke again. "I heard him screech when I was at their wheel. He must have got hurt up aloft." Stubbins struck a match and proceeded to relight his pipe. "How do you mean?" he asked, speaking for the first time. "How do I mean? Well, I can't say. Maybe he jammed his finger between the parrel and the mast." "What about his swearing at their second mate? What that caused a jam? What was that cause he jammed his fingers?" put in Keelan. "I never heard about that," said Plummer. "Who hurt him?"
I should think everybody in their bloomin' ship heard him, Stubborn answered. All the same, I ain't sure he was swearing. He was swearing at the second mate. I thought at first he'd gone dotty and was cussin' him, but somehow it don't seem likely. Now I come to think, I don't stand to reason he should go to cuss their man. There was nothing to go cussin' about. What's more, he didn't seem to be talking down to us on deck. When I could make out how he sides, what would he want to go talking to the second mate about his payday? He looked across to where I was sitting. Jock, who was smoking quietly on the chest next to me, took his pipe slowly out from between his teeth. You're no far out, Stubbins, I'm thinking. You're no far out, he said, nodding his head. Stubbins still continued to gaze at me. What's your ID? He said abruptly. It may have been my fancy, but it seemed to me that there was something deeper than the mere sense the question conveyed. I glanced at him. I couldn't have said myself just what my idea was. I don't know, I answered, a little adrift. He didn't strike me as cursing at the second mate. That is, I should say, after the first minute. Just what I say, he replied. Another thing. Don't it strike you as bloomin' queer that Tom nearly coming down by their run, and then this? I nodded. It would have been all hup with Tom if it hadn't been for the gasket. He paused after a moment. He went on again. That was only 3 or 4 nights ago. Well, said Plummer, what are you driving at? Nothing, he answered Stubbins. Only it's damned queer. Looks as though their ship might be unlucky after all. Well, agreed Plummer. Things has been a bit funny lately. And then there's what happened tonight. I shall hang on pretty tight there next time I go aloft. Old Jasket took his pipe from his mouth and sighed. Things is going wrong most every night, he said, almost pathetically. As if it's as different as chalk and cheese to what it were when we started this 'ere trip. I thought it were all ellish rot about her being 'aunted, but it's not, seemingly. He stopped and expectorated. She ain't haunted, said Stubbins. Leastwise, not like you mean. He paused as though trying to grasp some elusive thought. Eh? Said Jasket in the interval. Stubbins continued without noticing the query. He appeared to be answering some half-formed thought in his own brain rather than Jasket. Things is queer, and it's been a bad job tonight. I don't savvy one bit what Williams was saying about up loft. I've thought sometimes he'd something on his mind. Then, after a pause of about half a minute, he said this. Who was he saying that to? Eh? Said Jaskins with a puzzled expression. I was thinking, said Stubbins, knocking out his pipe on the edge of the chest. Perhaps you're right, after all. Me not found 07. If I can't make someone smile and make them cry, why would you say that? Why would you say that? It's a weird thing to say, my dude. But welcome. I hope you're enjoying the story. We're but I think on that note, I think that's a good place to leave this tale until next week. I think we'll pick this back up next Monday, and we'll find out what happens to the rest of the crew while we mourn poor Williams. I'll be streaming tomorrow night.
probably God of War. Thank you for coming.